Stand on the Motoyasu River Bridge in Hiroshima this morning, and you will see schoolchildren, streetcars, coffee shops, a city of more than 1 million people going about an ordinary day. Then look across the water. There stands a skeleton of brick and steel, kept in ruin on purpose, while everything around it was rebuilt. Most cities hide their worst day. Hiroshima built itself around it. This is the story of a castle town on a river delta that became an empire's fortress. Then a target. And then, for one morning in August of 1945, the center of human history. And it is the story of what came after. The silence, the courage, the deliberate choice not to disappear. More than 400 years in one journey. It begins, as these stories often do, with a river and a man who needed a castle. The water is waiting. Let's go down to the delta. Chapter 1. The Castle on the Delta. In the year 1589, a young warlord stood at the edge of the Seto Inland Sea, in the far west of Japan, and looked out at a place that most military men of his time would have rejected without a second thought. It was a delta. The Ota River came down from the mountains of the interior and, as it reached the sea, split apart into multiple channels, braiding itself through banks of sand and silt. The land between those channels was low, soft, and wet, much of it flooded, some of it barely qualified as land at all. It was the kind of ground that swallows foundations and drowns ambitions. The warlord's name was Mori Terumoto, and he saw something else entirely. Terumoto was the grandson of Mori Motonari, one of the most brilliant strategists of Japan's warring states period, a man who had taken a minor provincial family and built it into a power that controlled much of western Japan. But the Mori family fortress at Yoshida Koriyama sat deep in the mountains. It was superb for defense and nearly useless for everything else. And by 1589, everything else was what mattered. Japan was changing. After more than a century of civil war, the country was being unified under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Terumoto had chosen to serve him rather than fight him. In this new Japan, power would no longer flow only from mountain castles and armies. It would flow from rice, from trade, from ships, from control of the routes that connected the country to itself. And the Seto Inland Sea was the greatest trade highway in Japan. A calm, island-sheltered waterway that moved goods and people and information along the length of the country, the way great rivers move them through other civilizations. A castle in the mountains could defend the past. A castle on the delta could command the future. So Terumoto made the kind of decision that founders of great cities have made throughout history. On the Thames, on the Seine, on the Hudson. He looked at difficult ground in a perfect location and decided the location was worth the difficulty. Great cities are almost never founded on the best land. They are founded on the most connected land, and then generations of people spend centuries paying for that choice, driving piles into mud, raising embankments, fighting the water. Hiroshima would be no exception. Construction began in 1589 on the largest island of the delta. Thousands of labourers sank wooden foundations into the soft ground, raised stone walls above them, and dug moats that connected to the river channels, so that the water which threatened the site also defended it. At the centre rose a 5-story castle keep, and around the castle a town began to grow, laid out in the ordered way of Japanese castle towns, with districts for samurai, districts for merchants, districts for craftsmen, and temples placed at the edges where they could double as defensive strongpoints. The place needed a name, According to the traditional account preserved in the records of the castle town, the name Hiroshima was chosen at the founding, and its most direct reading is simply Broad Island, a plain description of the wide delta island on which the castle stood. Local tradition also holds that the name honored ancestors and allies of the Mori family whose names contained those same elements. Historians still debate the exact weighting of those explanations. What is not debated is what the name became. Within a generation, this artificial city on the mud was one of the most important places in Western Japan. And here is a small detail worth holding on to. The castle came to be known as Rijo, the Carp Castle. The exact origin of that nickname is uncertain, though the area's association with carp is old and well documented. Remember the carp, nearly 4 centuries later, when this city needs a symbol of stubborn life more than any city has ever needed one. The carp will come back. Now, think about what Terremoto had actually built, because the geography he chose in 1589 is the single most important fact in this entire story, and it will remain the most important fact all the way to the summer of 1945. He had built a city that was almost perfectly flat, spread across low islands, with mountains standing back from it in a wide ring, like the walls of an enormous natural bowl. Every advantage that made the delta valuable came from that shape. Flat land was easy to build on once the flooding was managed. The river channels were natural streets for boats. The surrounding mountains sheltered the city and funneled trade toward it. For 3.5 centuries, that bowl of flat, open, water-veined land was Hiroshima's greatest gift. And then, on one August morning, a committee of men on the other side of the Pacific Ocean would look at that same geography, the flatness, the openness, the compact density, the ring of hills that would contain and reflect a blast wave, and they would see something no one in 1589 could have imagined. We will meet those men in a later chapter, and we will read what they actually wrote. For now, simply understand this. Nothing about Hiroshima's selection was random. The qualities that created the city and the qualities that marked it were the same qualities. That is not a coincidence. That is the terrible symmetry at the heart of this story. But in the 1590s, all of that lay in an unimaginable future, and the new city's first crisis came not from geography but from politics. Mori Terremoto had risen high. Under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, he became one of the 5 great lords. The Council of Elders appointed to govern Japan on behalf of Hideyoshi's young heir after the old ruler's death in 1598. On paper, Terremoto was one of the 5 most powerful men in the country, ruling a vast domain from his gleaming new castle on the delta. The arrangement lasted barely 2 years. In 1600, the rivalry between Hideyoshi's loyalists and the ambitious eastern lord Tokugawa Ieyasu exploded into open war, and Japan divided into 2 great coalitions. Terremoto was named the formal head of the Western Alliance. His name gave the cause legitimacy. His armies gave it weight. And when the 2 coalitions met at Sekigahara in October of 1600, in one of the decisive battles of Japanese history, the West collapsed in a single day. Undone by defections on the field, Terremoto himself was not there. He had remained behind at Osaka, and historians have argued ever since about whether his caution was wisdom, indecision, or quiet negotiation with the enemy. Whatever it was, it did not save him. The victorious Tokugawa stripped the Mori family of most of its territory. The domain that had stretched across western Japan was cut down to a fraction of its former size, and Terremoto was sent away to the far southwestern tip of Honshu, to the remote town of Hagi, The man who founded Hiroshima ruled it for barely a decade, and then lost it forever, punished for a battle he never personally fought. There is a strange historical echo here, and it is worth a moment. The descendants of the Mori, nursing that humiliation in their reduced domain of Choshu for 2.5 centuries, would eventually help lead the revolution that overthrew the Tokugawa in the 1860s and created modern Japan. And that modern Japan, as we will see, is precisely the state that turned Hiroshima into a military city and set it on the road to August of 1945. The founder's defeat and the city's future are connected by a very long fuse. But that is getting ahead of the story. In 1600, Hiroshima was simply a young castle town that had just lost its founding family, waiting to learn who its new master would be, and whether the improbable city on the mud would survive its first change of hands. It would do more than survive. Under the lords who came next, Hiroshima was about to enjoy 2.5 centuries of something that almost no Western city of the same era ever experienced. Almost unbroken peace. That peace is where we go next. Chapter 2. 250 years of peace. The new master of Hiroshima arrived in the 1600 as a reward for treason. His name was Fukushima Masanori, and he had been one of the Western coalition's most celebrated generals. A hard-drinking, hard-fighting commander who had made his name in Hideyoshi's wars. But at the decisive moment he had thrown his weight behind the Tokugawa, and when the dust of Sekigahara settled, the victors handed him the Mori family's crown jewel, the castle on the delta and the rich lands around it. Masanori ruled Hiroshima for nearly 2 decades, and then he lost it in one of the strangest ways any lord ever lost a domain. In 1617, floods badly damaged Hiroshima Castle. Masanori repaired it. That sounds like responsible governance. Under Tokugawa law, it was a crime. The new regime, obsessed with preventing another civil war, had made it illegal for any lord to repair or modify a castle without written permission from the government in Edo. Masanori had asked. The paperwork had stalled, and he had gone ahead anyway. In 1619, the Tokugawa used those repairs as the pretext to strip him of Hiroshima entirely. Think about what that tells you. In the New Japan, a man could survive switching sides in a civil war, but he could not survive fixing his own flood-damaged walls without a permit. Europe in the same era was tearing itself apart in the 30 Years' War, one of the most destructive conflicts in human history. Japan had entered an age where the government's control was so total that stonework was politics. Historians still argue about whether the Tokugawa peace was an achievement or a cage. It was probably both, but it held, and it held for 2.5 centuries. The family that replaced Masanori would rule Hiroshima for the entire duration of that peace. They were the Asano, and they governed the city from 1619 until the modern era. 12 generations of the same house. An unbroken line of rule that almost no European city of the period can match. And if the name Asano sounds faintly familiar to you, there is a reason. A branch of this same family, the Asano lords of the small domain of Ako, produced the incident of the 47 Ronin, the most famous samurai story ever told. The tale of loyal retainers avenging their disgraced master that has been retold in Japan for 3 centuries and eventually made its way into American films. The lords of Hiroshima were the senior house of that family. When the scandal broke in 1701, it was Hiroshima that had to manage the political fallout of its relatives' catastrophe, sheltering some of the survivors of the ruined branch and quietly absorbing the embarrassment. under the Asano. The improbable city on the mud grew into one of the largest castle towns in Japan, with a population that scholars of the period estimate at around 70,000 by the 18th century, larger than most European cities of the same era. And what is striking, looking at the records of this period, is how little of that growth had to do with samurai. So instead of describing the peace from the castle keep, let us describe it from the street, because the street is where Hiroshima actually lived. Imagine a single morning in the 1750s, in the merchant quarter south of the castle. A rice dealer opens the wooden shutters of a shop his grandfather opened before him. He can hear the boatmen calling on the river channel behind the storehouses, poling flat-bottomed barges loaded with salt from the coastal pans, cotton from the inland villages, and paper from the mountain valleys, all of it moving toward the inland sea routes and the great market city of Osaka. His wife is checking bales of rush grass that arrived overnight, the raw material of the region's most famous product, the woven tatami mats that covered the floor of nearly every room in Japan. Down the lane, a neighbor family is loading racks of oysters, because along the calm, nutrient-rich coastline, the people of this bay had been perfecting something since the 1500s. The cultivation of oysters on ropes and rafts suspended in the sea. Hiroshima oysters were already a delicacy shipped to Osaka in special boats. They remain the city's signature food today. And when you see oyster rafts floating in Hiroshima Bay in 2026, you are looking at an industry older than the city itself. None of these people carried swords. That is the point. The domain was wealthy on paper because of rice, since rice was how all wealth was officially measured in Tokugawa Japan, and the Hiroshima domain ranked among the richest in the country. But the city's real life was commercial, practical, and stubbornly unheroic. Merchants kept ledgers across generations. Temple schools taught children to read and calculate, part of the quiet spread of literacy that left Tokugawa Japan. By the estimates of historians of education, among the more literate societies in the world at the time, festivals marked the year. Fires and floods came, were survived, and were rebuilt after, because in a city of timber and paper on a river delta, rebuilding was simply a skill you had. Here is the comparison that puts this era in perspective. While that rice dealer was opening his shutters, London burned down and was rebuilt, fought 3 wars against the Dutch, executed 1 king and expelled another, built Versailles, starved, and stockpiled the resentments that would explode into revolution. The American colonies were declared, fought for, and became a nation. Hiroshima, in those same centuries, experienced almost nothing that a Western historian would even call an event. No invasion, no siege, no revolution. The great disasters of Tokugawa-era Hiroshima were floods, fires, and famines, terrible in their moment, but local, survivable, ordinary. It is tempting to call those centuries uneventful and skip ahead. That would be a mistake, because the peace built the very things that would matter most in this story's darkest chapter. The peace built density. By the 1800s, tens of thousands of people lived packed into the wooden districts of the Delta, in houses of timber and paper standing wall to wall along narrow streets. A city built almost entirely of flammable material on flat, open ground. The peace built continuity, families that stayed for generations, neighborhood shrines, school lineages, merchant houses with centuries of records, and the peace built a civic identity that was commercial and practical rather than military. For 250 years, Hiroshima was a city of merchants, farmers of the sea, and administrators. The irony is brutal, and you can already see it coming. The city that history remembers as a military target spent most of its existence as one of the least military places in Japan. That was about to change with astonishing speed. And the change began, of all places, off the coast of America's future ally and enemy at once. In the 1850s, American warships under Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Japanese waters and forced open a country that had been closed to most of the world for over 2 centuries. The shock of that arrival set off a chain reaction that brought down the Tokugawa government itself. And leading the revolution were samurai from 2 domains in particular, Satsuma in the far south, and Choshu, the reduced domain where the descendants of Mori Terremoto, Hiroshima's exiled founder, had been nursing their grievance against the Tokugawa for 250 years. The long fuse we lit in Chapter 1 had finally burned down. The founders' heirs helped destroy the old order, and the new Japan they built was about to reach back to the city Terremoto founded and hand it a completely new identity. The rice dealer's great-grandchildren were about to become citizens of an empire. Chapter 3. The Emperor's Western Fortress. Every city in Japan had to reinvent itself after 1868. The revolution that historians call the Meiji Restoration replaced the Tokugawa government with a centralized state built around the emperor, abolished the samurai class, dissolved the domains, and launched Japan on one of the fastest modernization programs any nation has ever attempted. The new government's leaders had seen what European empires were doing to China, and they drew a cold conclusion. A country was either strong enough to be a predator or weak enough to be prey. There was no third category. In 1871, the Asano domain ceased to exist, replaced by Hiroshima Prefecture, run by governors appointed from Tokyo. 12 generations of one family's rule ended with a piece of paper, and the city on the delta had to answer the question every city faced in the new Japan. What are you for? Hiroshima's answer was decided partly by ambition and partly, once again, by geography. The city sat at the natural gateway between the Japanese heartland and the continent of Asia. Whoever controlled the route from Tokyo and Osaka toward Korea and China passed through the inland sea, and Hiroshima commanded it. In the 17th century that had made the city a merchant hub. In the age of steamships and empire, it made the city something else entirely. 2 construction projects sealed that new identity, and it is worth knowing them by name, because between them they redirected the entire future of the city. The first was the port of Ujina. Hiroshima's delta location had one great weakness. The harbour was shallow, silting, unsuited to modern deep-water ships. In the 1880s, the prefectural governor, Senda Sadaki, pushed through a massive land reclamation and harbour project south of the city. It nearly ruined him. The project ran over budget. Local merchants attacked it as a boondoggle, and contemporary accounts describe the governor as one of the most criticized men in the region. The port was completed in 1889, 300 years after Terremoto broke ground on his castle. For a few quiet years it looked like an expensive mistake, an oversized harbour without enough trade to fill it. The second project was the railway, the Sanyo line, pushing west from Osaka along the inland sea coast, reached Hiroshima in June of 1894. The timing changes everything, and you need the dates side by side to see it. The railway arrived in June. In August, Japan went to war with China over control of Korea, the first foreign war of Japan's modern era, And at that moment, Hiroshima happened to be the exact point where the railhead from Tokyo met a modern military port. Troops could ride the rails to Hiroshima, march to Ujina, and board ships for the continent. The expensive mistake had become, overnight, the most strategically valuable harbour in the country. What happened next has almost no parallel in the modern history of any city. In September of 1894, the Imperial General Headquarters, the supreme command of the Japanese armed forces, moved from Tokyo to Hiroshima. And it did not come alone. Emperor Meiji himself moved to Hiroshima and lived inside the castle grounds for 7 months, directing the war from the compound that Mori Terremoto had built 3 centuries earlier. The national parliament followed, convening in a hastily built hall in the city. It remains the only time in modern Japanese history that the Diet has met outside Tokyo. For those 7 months, Hiroshima was, in every functional sense, the capital of Japan. Decisions of war and state flowed from the castle on the delta. A city that had spent 250 years as a merchant town was suddenly the nerve center of an empire at war, and everyone in Japan knew its name. Stop and consider what that experience does to a city's identity, because this is the hinge of the entire story. The proudest moment in Hiroshima's modern history, the moment it mattered most to the nation, was a moment of war. The emperor in the castle, the troops parading to the docks, the economy booming with military contracts, uniforms, provision, transport. The lesson the city absorbed in 1894 was simple and seductive. War was not a threat to Hiroshima. War was Hiroshima's opportunity. The city acted on that lesson. The 5th Division of the Imperial Army made Hiroshima its permanent home. Military facilities multiplied across the delta. Barracks, arsenals, supply depots, parade grounds, a military academy. Ujina grew into the army's principal embarkation port, the doorway through which Japanese soldiers left for the continent. A supporting economy of provisioners and manufacturers grew around the garrison, the way finance grew around the ports of New York or Liverpool. By the turn of the century, the merchant city had rebuilt itself as something new. Soldiers in the streets were as ordinary a sight as oyster boats in the bay. Japan won its war with China in 1895, decisively, shockingly, and announced itself as a rising power. The victory brought territory, indemnity money, and international respect, and it also brought a taste for more. Within a decade, Japan's ambitions in Korea and Manchuria would collide with the ambitions of a European great power, the Russian Empire, and the collision would produce a war that stunned the world. Hiroshima would once again be the doorway through which that war was fought, and with every conflict, every embarkation, every expansion of the garrison, the city bound its fortunes more tightly to the fortunes of the Japanese military, climbing a ladder that seemed, for 50 years, to lead only upward. From where we stand, we can see where the ladder actually led. The city could not. That climb, and the ordinary lives lived inside a military city, is where we go next. Chapter 4. The Military City. In February of 1904, Japan did something that almost no one in the Western world believed possible. It went to war with the Russian Empire, one of the great powers of Europe, and it began winning. For Hiroshima, the Russo-Japanese War was the 1890s all over again, but on a far larger scale. Once more the troop trains rolled in from the east. Once more the columns marched from the station through the city streets to the docks at Ujina. Historical records of the port show hundreds of thousands of soldiers passing through Hiroshima on their way to Manchuria and the siege of Port Arthur. The city was the funnel through which the entire land war flowed. Its hospitals received the wounded coming back. Its factories and provisioners supplied the armies going out. Its railway platforms saw farewells, and its docks saw what remained of divisions returning. Japan's victory in 1905 shocked the world. For the first time in the modern era, an Asian nation had defeated a European great power in a full-scale war. American President Theodore Roosevelt brokered the peace treaty and won the Nobel Peace Prize for it. Newspapers from London to New York struggled to absorb what had happened. And in Hiroshima, the lesson of 1894 was confirmed a second time, and more emphatically. War meant relevance. War meant prosperity. War meant that the city on the Delta mattered. We should be careful here, and honest. It is easy, looking backward through the lens of 1945, to describe Hiroshima in these decades as a city marching knowingly toward catastrophe. That is not what living there felt like, and a story told with respect has to hold both truths at once. So let us do what we did in the Tokugawa chapter. Let us come down from the map and stand in the street. It is a spring morning in 1915, and you are standing on a new boulevard near the river. A streetcar clatters past you, one of the electric cars that began running through the city in 1912, connecting the station to the port and the neighborhoods in between. Remember those streetcars. Hold on to them the way you are holding on to the carp, because they will return at one of the most important moments in this entire story. Across the street, a department store has opened its doors. There are cinemas now, showing silent films. Schoolgirls in Western-style uniforms walk past a noodle shop toward the girls' academy. And, on the far bank of the Motoyasu River, workmen are finishing a building unlike anything else in the city. A grand exhibition hall in the European style, with a copper-clad oval dome on top, designed by a Czech architect named Jan Letzel and opened in 1915 as the Hiroshima Prefectural Commercial Exhibition Hall. The people of the city simply called it the building with the dome. It was elegant, slightly foreign, and beloved. It hosted trade fairs and art exhibitions. It displayed the products of the prefecture, the tatami and the sake and the oysters, to buyers from across Japan. Photographs from the period, preserved today by the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, show it reflected in the river, with pleasure boats passing in front of it. Hold that image. You already know, from the opening minutes of this film, what that building becomes. The skeleton across the water in 2026 and the pride of the city in 1915 are the same structure. We will meet it twice more, once at the worst moment in the city's history, and once at the moment the city decided what its history would mean. The First World War, when it came in 1914, touched Hiroshima in a way that says a great deal about how far away Europe's catastrophe felt. Japan joined the war on the side of Britain and its allies, seized German colonial possessions in China and the Pacific, and otherwise experienced the conflict mainly as an economic boom. Hiroshima's most notable wartime story was a prisoner of war camp on the nearby island of Ninoshima, where captured German soldiers waited out the war. And in 1919, at an exhibition of goods made by those German prisoners, held inside that very exhibition hall with the dome, a prisoner named Karl Juchheim baked and sold a traditional German layered cake called Baumkuchen. According to the well-documented history of the company that still bears his name, it was the first Baumkuchen ever made in Japan. Juchheim stayed in Japan after his release, built a confectionery business, and Baumkuchen went on to become one of the most beloved cakes in the country. Sold today in every Japanese department store. Sit with that detail for a moment, because it may be the gentlest irony in this entire story. In the First Great Industrial War, Hiroshima's encounter with the enemy produced cake, baked by a prisoner, inside the building that would one day be the most famous ruin on earth. History does not usually offer symbols that perfect. When it does, they are worth remembering. But the 1920s and 30s turned darker, and the turn was national, not local. Japan's parliamentary democracy, always fragile, buckled under economic crisis. The Great Depression devastated Japanese exports and rural livelihoods. Within the army, factions of radical young officers came to believe that the political class was corrupt and that Japan's salvation lay in expansion abroad and military rule at home. Assassinations of politicians and business leaders punctuated the decade. In 1931, army officers in Manchuria manufactured a pretext and seized the entire region, presenting Tokyo with a conquest the civilian government had never approved. The government accepted it. Each time the army acted and faced no consequence, the next act became easier. Here is the editorial point, and it matters for understanding everything that follows. Militarism did not arrive in Japan as a sudden madness. It arrived the way water rises, one acceptable compromise at a time, in a society where the army had been a source of pride, employment, and national survival for 2 generations. And nowhere was that more true than in Hiroshima, a city whose greatest moments, whose economic lifeblood, whose very identity since 1894 had been bound to the fortunes of the imperial military. The city did not choose the road to 1945 in any single decision. It had been placed on that road decades earlier, and by the 1930s, no one in Hiroshima, and almost no one in Japan, had the power to leave it. In July of 1937, Japanese and Chinese troops exchanged fire at a bridge outside Beijing, and the incident spiraled into full-scale war with China. The 5th Division marched out of Hiroshima once again. The troop trains rolled. The docks at Ujina filled. And the pattern that had always meant prosperity began again. This time, the war would not stay on the other side of the sea. Chapter 5. War Comes Home. The war with China was supposed to be short. It swallowed Japan instead. By 1938, the fighting had spread across a front so vast that even a string of Japanese victories could not end it. The army took cities. The war continued. Japan's resources strained. Rationing spread, and the state reached deeper and deeper into ordinary life. In Hiroshima, the garrison economy ran at full capacity, and the port of Ujina worked without pause. On that same island of Ninoshima, where German prisoners had once baked bread and cake, the army's quarantine and logistics stations processed the endless traffic of an endless war. Then, in December of 1941, Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, and the war became the Pacific War, and everything that had been strained became desperate. We will not retell the entire Pacific War here. What matters for our story is how, month by month, the war closed in on a city that had always sent war outward and had never once received it. At first, the change was invisible. 1942 and 1943 brought defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal, but censorship kept the true picture from the Japanese public, and Hiroshima's daily life was one of shortages and mobilization rather than fear. Neighborhood associations organized rationing and fire drills. Women joined labor service. Students were drafted into factories, the city's industries, including a company called Toyo Kogyo that would one day be known worldwide as Mazda, converted to war production, making rifles and military equipment. The turning point that mattered most for Japanese cities came in 1944, when American forces captured the Mariana Islands. From those islands, the new B-29 bomber could reach the Japanese home islands, and beginning in late 1944, and with horrifying intensity from March of 1945, American air raids began systematically burning Japan's cities. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night. According to post-war studies including the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, Osaka burned, Nagoya burned, Kobe burned. By summer, the bombing campaign had worked its way down the list to cities a fraction of Hiroshima's size. Hiroshima prepared, and the preparations reshaped the city in ways that would place thousands of its most vulnerable people in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. The government's answer to firebombing was demolition. Since Japanese cities were built of wood and paper, the plan was to tear down long strips of houses to create fire breaks, open corridors that a firestorm could not jump. In Hiroshima, tens of thousands of buildings were marked for destruction, their families relocated, their timbers pulled down, and the labor for this work came, in large part, from students, under national mobilization orders. Boys and girls of secondary school age were assigned to demolition sites in the center of the city, working outdoors day after day, clearing the torn-down houses. At the same time, the city evacuated its youngest children. In the final year of the war, thousands of school children were sent out of Hiroshima to temples and villages in the countryside, some with their entire school classes, separated from their parents to keep them safe from the raids everyone knew were coming. Hold both of those images side by side. The youngest children sent away to safety, their older brothers and sisters ordered into the open heart of the city. Two administrative decisions, both perfectly rational by the logic of firebombing, and together they would divide thousands of Hiroshima families into the living and the dead. And still the bombers did not come. That is the strangest fact about Hiroshima in the summer of 1945, and the people who lived there felt its strangeness at the time. Air raid sirens sounded constantly as B-29s passed overhead on their way to other targets. The alerts came so often, and so little happened, that a dangerous familiarity set in. Survivor accounts collected by the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum describe the rumors that ran through the city that summer. Some said Hiroshima was spared because so many local families had emigrated to America, and the Americans were being careful with their relatives' hometown. Some said the Americans were saving the city for something special. That second rumor was closer to the truth than anyone could bear to imagine. The real reason was written in classified minutes on the other side of the Pacific. American target planners had deliberately set Hiroshima aside, directing conventional raids elsewhere, precisely because they wanted an untouched city. An intact city was a measurable city. The full meaning of that decision belongs to the next chapter, where we will cross the ocean and read what the planners actually wrote. So picture Hiroshima on the 5th of August, 1945, because this is the city we must hold in our minds, a city of roughly 350,000 people, soldiers and civilians together, by the commonly cited estimates published by the City of Hiroshima, a city of wooden houses on flat open ground, ringed by hills, a city where the streetcars still ran on time, where the building with the dome still stood by the river, now converted to government offices. A city where the morning of August 6th would begin with an all-clear signal, after a night of alerts that had, as always, come to nothing. Children who had not been evacuated walking to their work sites. Thousands of students already outdoors in the demolition zones, in the open, in the center. A city that had waited all summer for a raid that never came, not knowing that its name had been at the top of a very short list for months. To understand why, we have to leave Japan entirely. We have to go back 3 years, to a secret project in the American desert, and to a committee room where a handful of men compared cities the way engineers compare materials. That room is where we go next. Chapter 6. The Choice. To understand why Hiroshima, we have to leave the Delta and cross the Pacific, and we have to go back to a letter written before the war between Japan and America even began. In August of 1939, Albert Einstein signed a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt, drafted with the physicist Leo Szilard, warning that recent discoveries in nuclear physics might make possible a bomb of unprecedented power, and that Nazi Germany might be pursuing one. That letter set in motion what became, by 1942, the Manhattan Project, one of the largest secret undertakings in human history. At its peak, it employed well over 100,000 people across sites in Tennessee, Washington State, and New Mexico, most of whom did not know what they were building. The scientific work was led by the physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer at a laboratory in Los Alamos. The military command belonged to General Leslie Groves. Notice the original logic. The bomb was conceived as a race against Hitler, but Germany surrendered in May of 1945, before the weapon was ready, and the project did not stop. Its momentum carried forward, and its target shifted to the one enemy still fighting. Historians have debated ever since whether that shift was ever seriously questioned inside the American government, and the honest answer, based on the documentary record, is that it was barely questioned at all. The machine had been built to be used. The question was where, and here we arrive at one of the most extraordinary documents of the 20th century, because we do not have to guess at the reasoning. The minutes of the Target Committee, the group of officers and scientists assigned to choose the bomb's targets, were declassified decades ago and are held today in the United States National Archives. Anyone can read them. Few documents in any archive are colder. The committee met in the spring of 1945, including a key session at Los Alamos on May 10th and 11th. According to those minutes, the members were looking for targets that met specific criteria. The target should be a large urban area, more than 3 miles across. It should be capable of being effectively damaged by blast, and it should be untouched by previous bombing, so that the effect of this single new weapon could be accurately measured. That last requirement answers the question the people of Hiroshima had been asking all summer. The city had not been spared. It had been preserved. The absence of bombs was not mercy. It was methodology. The clean conditions of a measurement whose subject was a city full of people. Now recall Chapter 1 and the geography of Mori Terremoto's delta. Flat, compact, densely built, ringed by hills that, in the committee's assessment as recorded in the minutes, were likely to focus and increase the blast effect. Every quality that had made Hiroshima a good place to build a city in 1589 made it, by the committee's criteria, a good place to destroy one. That is the terrible symmetry we promised at the beginning of this story. And here it is, written down in plain administrative English in May of 1945. One city on the early lists was removed, and the story of its removal tells you something important. Kyoto, the ancient capital, met every technical criterion. It was Secretary of War Henry Stimson who insisted on striking it from the list, over military objections, arguing that Kyoto's cultural and religious significance made its destruction indefensible. Stimson knew the city, and by several historical accounts he had visited it. His intervention is often told as a story of conscience, and in part it was, but notice what it means. The men making these decisions understood that some targets carried moral weight beyond military calculation. They debated it, and having removed Kyoto, they confirmed Hiroshima at the top of the list. The conscience that saved one city did not extend to the next name on the page. What did the planners believe about Hiroshima itself? The record shows they described it as a military target of genuine significance. And this was not fiction. As we have seen across 4 chapters, Hiroshima was the home of the 5th Division, the headquarters of the 2nd General Army commanding the defense of Western Japan, and the embarkation port of Ujina. Tens of thousands of soldiers were stationed in the city. But the record also shows the planners knew the bomb would not distinguish between the garrison and the city around it, between the headquarters and the school children clearing fire breaks half a mile away. The aiming point ultimately chosen was not a military installation. It was a distinctive T-shaped bridge in the center of the city, the Aioi Bridge, selected because it was easy to see from the air. In July, the pieces converged. On July 16th, in the New Mexico desert, the first atomic device was successfully tested. Its power exceeded predictions. President Harry Truman, who had learned of the bomb's existence only upon taking office in April after Roosevelt's death, received word of the test while meeting Allied leaders at Potsdam. On July 25th, the formal order was issued. It was a directive from Acting Army Chief of Staff, General Thomas Handy, to General Karl Spaatz, commander of the Strategic Air Forces in the Pacific, instructing that the first special bomb be delivered as soon as weather permitted visual bombing after about August 3rd, on one of 4 listed cities. The first city named in that order was Hiroshima. The document survives, declassified, in the United States National Archives, and its language is worth knowing for one detail. It authorized not one bombing but a process, stating that additional bombs would be delivered as soon as they were made ready. On July 26th, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender and warning, without specifics, of prompt and utter destruction. Japan's government, deadlocked between factions, gave a response widely translated as treating the declaration with silent contempt, though historians still debate whether the word used, mokusatsu, was meant as rejection or as withholding comment while the cabinet maneuvered. On that ambiguity, among other things, the future turned. The debate over the decision itself has never ended, and we owe you both sides of it, stated fairly. The case made by Truman and Stimson, and defended by many historians since, is that the bomb ended the war quickly and averted an invasion of Japan that would have cost enormous numbers of lives, American and Japanese alike, with casualty projections for the planned invasion running from hundreds of thousands upward depending on the estimate. The case against, argued by historians such as Gar Alperovitz and weighed in different ways by scholars such as Tsuyoshi Hasegawa, holds that Japan was already near collapse, that the Soviet declaration of war in August was itself a decisive shock, that alternatives such as a demonstration or modified surrender terms were never seriously pursued, and that the speed of use had as much to do with the emerging rivalry with the Soviet Union as with saving lives. Respected scholars sit on both sides. This film will not pretend the question is settled, because it is not, and pretending otherwise would betray both the dead and the truth. What is settled is what happened next. On the island of Tinian, a specially trained unit of the American Air Forces, the 509th Composite Group, made its final preparations. The bomb they would carry was a uranium weapon the crews called Little Boy. The first target, weather permitting, was Hiroshima. On the night of August 5th, the crews were briefed and the bomb was loaded. In Hiroshima that same night, the sirens sounded, and then the all clear, and the city went to sleep expecting another ordinary day. The next chapter is that day. We will tell it quietly. Chapter 7, August 6th, 1945, 8:15 in the morning. This chapter will be quieter than the ones before it. Some events do not need a storyteller's voice raised. They need it lowered. At 2:45 in the morning, Tinian time, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay, after the pilot's mother, lifted off carrying the weapon. The pilot was Colonel Paul Tibbets. The flight north took about 6 hours. Ahead of it flew a weather plane, whose job was to report which of the possible target cities lay under clear skies. In Hiroshima, the morning of August 6th was hot, still, and bright. Around 7 in the morning, sirens sounded as the weather plane passed over. And then, when it turned away, the all clear followed. People came out of shelters and went back to their mornings. It was a little after 8. The streetcars we have followed since 1912 were running full, carrying workers and students into the centre. Soldiers were at morning assembly on the parade grounds near the castle. Government clerks were arriving at their desks inside the domed exhibition hall by the river, and across the heart of the city, thousands of mobilized students, the boys and girls we met in Chapter 5, were already outdoors at the demolition sites, beginning the day's work in the open air. The weather plane's report came through. Clear skies over the primary. Hiroshima was confirmed. At 8:15 and 17 seconds, local time, the Enola Gay released the bomb over the center of the city. It fell for about 43 seconds. The aiming point was the T-shaped Ioi Bridge. The detonation occurred at approximately 600 meters above the ground, almost directly over a private medical clinic called Shima Hospital, a few hundred feet from the bridge and from the hall with the dome. In that instant, a flash brighter than the sun, a pulse of heat that scorched everything exposed within a radius measured in miles, a blast wave that flattened the wooden city in seconds, and then, held and reflected by Terumoto's ring of hills, pressed down upon it. Within minutes, the fires ignited across the ruins joined into a single firestorm. Of the roughly 76,000 buildings in the city, records published by the City of Hiroshima state that about 92% were destroyed or damaged. We will not describe what the heat and the blast did to human bodies. You do not need those images from us. And the survivors themselves have asked the world for understanding, not spectacly. What we owe you instead is the scale. Stated plainly and sourced honestly, no exact count of the dead exists, or ever will, because the bomb destroyed the neighborhoods, the families, and the records that would have counted them. The city of Hiroshima estimates that by the end of December 1945, approximately 140,000 people had died. The Radiation Effects Research Foundation, the joint Japanese and American research institute that has studied the survivors for decades, cites a range of roughly 90,000 to 166,000 deaths by the end of that year. The honest number is not a number. It is a range wide enough to hold tens of thousands of unrecorded lives. And the width of that range is itself part of the historical record. A few details, preserved by the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, carry the moment better than any narration could. Wristwatches and clocks recovered from the ruins, their hands stopped at 8:15. The stone steps of a bank where the flash burned the shadow of a person who had been sitting there, waiting for the doors to open, into the granite itself, and beside the Aoi Bridge, the exhibition hall where Carl Juchheim had once baked his cake, one of the very few structures left standing near the Hypo Center, because the blast came down almost vertically upon it and its brick walls and iron dome frame, though gutted and burned, did not fall. Its skeleton still stands today. You saw it in the opening minutes of this film. The world knows it now as the atomic bomb dome. Of the students working in the open at the demolition sites, thousands died. The records of the city and the Peace Memorial Museum preserve their school names and their ages. Many were 12 and 13 years old. Their younger brothers and sisters, evacuated to the countryside in the decisions we described in Chapter 5, survived, and many returned in the days that followed to search for families that no longer existed. In one morning, Hiroshima became a city of orphans in the hills and ashes on the delta. 16 hours later, on the other side of the world, the White House released a statement from President Truman announcing that an atomic bomb had been used against Hiroshima, describing it as a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. Most people in Japan, including most of the Japanese government, did not yet understand what had happened. Communications from Hiroshima had simply stopped. The first fragmentary reports reaching Tokyo said only that the city had been destroyed by a single flash, and that made no sense to anyone who heard it. In Hiroshima itself, there was no announcement, no explanation, no help arriving from a world that did not yet grasp what had occurred. There were only the wounded, the fires, the rivers, and the survivors beginning, in the first hours, to do what this city's story is ultimately about. They began to help each other. What happened in the days and weeks that followed, the improvised hospitals, the mysterious sickness no doctor could name, and the end of the war itself, is where we go next. Chapter 8. The Days After. The best record we have of what Hiroshima was like in the hours and weeks after the bomb comes from a doctor who was himself one of the wounded. His name was Michihiko Hachiya, and he was the director of the Hiroshima Communications Hospital, located about a mile from the Hypo Center. On the morning of August 6th, he was at home, resting after a night of air raid duty. When the flash came, his house collapsed around him. He was cut by flying glass and debris, badly enough that he later counted dozens of wounds, and in the first confused moments he could not find his own front door in the wreckage of his own home. And what he did next tells you everything about the weeks that followed. Bleeding, half-dressed, supported by his wife, he made his way through the burning streets toward his hospital, collapsing more than once along the way. He arrived as a patient, within days, still bandaged. He was working as its director again. From that day until the end of September, he kept a diary, published years later in English as Hiroshima Diary, and it remains one of the essential documents of the 20th century, precisely because it is not literature. It is a doctor's daily notes from inside an event that no medical training on earth had prepared anyone for. Through his eyes, and through the survivor testimonies preserved by the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, we can reconstruct those first days honestly, without invention. The hospitals that still stood, and most did not, were overwhelmed within the first hour. Hachiya's hospital, itself damaged and partly burned, filled with wounded until people lay in corridors, on stairs, in the garden outside. There was almost no medicine. There were almost no medical staff. Post-war surveys found that the great majority of the city's doctors and nurses had been killed or wounded in the first moments, which means the people most needed were the people least available. Those who could still stand worked with what they had, and what they had was very little. Hachiya's diary records the small, specific textures of those days that no summary can. The politeness of dying patients, the rumour mill running through the wards, his own guilt at eating when others could not, a colleague methodically performing autopsies in the ruins, trying to understand a disease that did not yet have a name. The survivors moved through the ruins searching for their families, calling out names at collapsed houses, checking the lists that began to appear at relief stations. The rivers of Teramoto's delta, the 6 channels that had given the city its life, filled with people seeking relief from their burns. Rescue came first, not from outside, but from within. Neighbours dug neighbours from under fallen roofs before the fires arrived. Soldiers from the garrison units that had survived on the city's edges organised relief stations. On the island of Ninoshima, the army quarantine station we have met twice before in this story, became an enormous field hospital, receiving thousands of the wounded by boat across the bay. Then, in the second week, something began to happen that broke the understanding of every doctor in the city. People who had survived the blast without a single visible wound began to sicken. Hachiya's diary records the confusion day by day, and reading it, you can feel medicine itself failing. Patients developed fever, bleeding gums, small purple spots beneath the skin. Their hair came out in handfuls. Their white blood cell counts, when they could be measured at all, had collapsed. People who had seemed to be recovering died suddenly, and no one could say why. Rumours swept the ruins that the city had been poisoned, that it would be uninhabitable for decades, that grass would never grow in Hiroshima for 70 years. Hold on to that rumour about the grass. The next chapter but one will answer it. Hachiya and his colleagues, cut off from the outside world, worked their way toward the truth by observation alone, comparing symptoms, mapping which patients had been where, at what distance, behind what walls. What they were seeing was acute radiation sickness, the invisible third weapon inside the bomb. After the heat and the blast, no one had told them it existed. They discovered it one patient at a time, and their observations, made with almost no equipment in a ruined hospital, would later prove remarkably accurate. This is why the death toll of Hiroshima can never be a single number, and why we gave you a range in the last chapter rather than false precision. People died in the flash, in the fires, in the collapses, and then they kept dying, through August, through the autumn, from radiation sickness and untreated injuries, un by un. In numbers, no one was in any condition to count. While Hiroshima struggled, the war ended around it, in 8 days of compressed history. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. On August 9th, a second atomic bomb, a plutonium weapon, was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, killing tens of thousands more. Nagasaki was not even the primary target that day. The mission's first target was the city of Kokura, which was obscured by clouds and haze, and the bomber diverted to its secondary, an entire city's fate, decided by the weather. Nagasaki's story deserves its own full telling. and we will not compress it into a paragraph here, except to say this: everything Hiroshima suffered, Nagasaki suffered 3 days later, and the two cities have carried the testimony together ever since. In Tokyo, the government deadlocked, half the Supreme Council insisting on fighting to the end even now. It took the personal intervention of Emperor Hirohito to break the tie. On August 15th, at noon, the emperor's recorded voice was broadcast to the nation, the first time most Japanese had ever heard him speak, announcing the surrender in formal court language so indirect that many listeners struggled to understand what was being said. In Hiroshima, survivors gathered around the radios that still worked. Hachiya's diary records the reaction in his hospital, and it was not relief. It was grief, disbelief, and among some of the wounded soldiers, fury. They had given everything, and it had ended in defeat. Only later would the other feeling come, the one that would eventually define the city. It was over. No one else's city would burn. The war had ended, but for Hiroshima, in a way the world would take years to understand. The event had not. It was only beginning to reveal what it was. Chapter 9. Silence and Censorship. Here is a fact that surprises almost every American audience. For years after 1945, the survivors of Hiroshima could not freely tell their own story, and the reason was written in the rules of the American occupation. In September 1945, Allied occupation forces arrived in Japan, and among the occupation's early acts was a sweeping press code. Under its rules, Japanese newspapers, magazines, and scientists were restricted from publishing material about the atomic bombings, including medical reports on radiation effects. Films and photographs from the ruined cities were confiscated or suppressed. Japanese film crews who had documented the aftermath had their footage seized. The stated purpose was to maintain public order during the occupation. The practical effect was that the two cities that most needed the world's understanding were, for years, the two cities least allowed to speak. Think about what that meant on the ground. Doctors like Hachiya, holding medical observations the entire world needed, could not publish them. His diary, written in 1945, did not appear in print until 1955. Survivors coping with a sickness no one would name aloud were left with rumor, and a strange vacuum formed around the largest single event of the war, a vacuum in which the American public was told the bombs had ended the war, and told very little else. Into that vacuum, in the spring of 1946, stepped a 31-year-old American reporter, and what he did with 30,000 words changed how the world understood the atomic age. His name was John Hersey. He was a war correspondent, already a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, and the New Yorker magazine sent him to Japan. In Hiroshima, he did something radical in its simplicity. Instead of writing about the bomb, the physics, the strategy, the statistics, he wrote about 6 people: a personnel clerk, a physician, a widowed seamstress raising 3 children, a German missionary priest, a young surgeon, a Methodist minister. He interviewed them at length and reconstructed their 6th of August, hour by hour, in plain, unemotional prose, and he let the facts do all of the work. The New Yorker took his report and made an unprecedented decision. On August 31st, 1946, the magazine devoted its entire issue to Hersey's article, titled simply Hiroshima. No cartoons, no other stories. The issue sold out within hours. Newspapers across America requested reprint rights. The full text was read aloud on national radio. The Book of the Month Club distributed free copies. And the book that followed has never gone out of print. For millions of Americans, Hersey's 6 survivors were the first Japanese human beings the war had ever shown them. Not caricatures, not an enemy, but a seamstress trying to find her children in the ruins of a Tuesday morning. Notice the shape of this moment, because it is one of the hinges of the whole story. The event was Japanese, the censorship was American, and the breakthrough was also American. A reporter and a magazine deciding the public deserved the truth. Hiroshima's story reached the world first in English, through American eyes, and that strange fact has shaped the city's relationship with America ever since. It is part of why, decades later, the city's message would be addressed to the world, and to Americans in particular, with so little hatred in it. The people of Hiroshima learned early that the country that dropped the bomb also contained the people most capable of listening, inside Japan. Meanwhile, the survivors were discovering that outliving the bomb was not the end of their ordeal. They came to be called Hibakusha. Literally, the bombing affected people, and the name carried weight no one wanted. As documented in decades of testimony collected by the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum and in the historical record of post-war Japan, Hibakusha faced discrimination in employment and, above all, in marriage. Families investigated prospective brides and grooms, and a Hiroshima background could end an engagement because of a fear, medically unfounded but socially powerful, that radiation exposure was contagious or hereditary. Many survivors learned to hide their scars, hide their city, hide their 6th of August. The people with the most important testimony of the century spent years learning to stay silent, first because of the censors, then because of their own society. The occupation ended in 1952, and the press code ended with it. Photographs and films the public had never seen were finally published in Japan, and the country confronted, 7 years late, the full images of what had happened on its own soil. In 1957, after years of pressure from survivor groups, Japan passed the first medical care law for Hibakusha, beginning a system of health support that continues today, built around institutions like the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, the joint Japanese and American research body that still studies the survivors' health in Hiroshima. And here the story reaches its lowest, quietest point. A ruined city, a censored history, survivors hiding their own names. By every reasonable expectation, Hiroshima in the late 1940s should have become what other destroyed places have become, a diminished town living in the shadow of a catastrophe, remembered by the world and abandoned by the future. Instead, the people of Hiroshima made a decision, formalized in a single law with a remarkable name, that turned their city into the opposite of a ruin. That decision is where we go next, and it begins with the answer to a rumor about grass. Chapter 10. The City That Refused to Disappear. In the winter after the bomb, a rumor hung over the ruins of Hiroshima, the one Dr. Hachiya heard in his wards. Nothing would grow here for 70 years. The city was poisoned ground. The rational thing to do was leave. And then, in the spring of 1946, the ruins turned green. Weeds pushed up through the ash, scorched camphor trees and willows, burned to blackened trunks, put out new leaves. Survivor accounts preserved by the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum describe people weeping at the sight of fresh shoots rising from trees everyone had given up for dead. Some of those trees are still alive today, registered and marked by the city as survivor trees, with small plaques recording their distance from the hypocenter, and you can stand under their shade in 2026. The 70 years rumor was wrong. Life had a different schedule. The people had a different schedule too. And here we come to a set of facts that, once you know them, permanently change how you see this city. The streetcars of Hiroshima, the ones we asked you to remember from 1912, started running again 3 days after the bomb. 3 days, on August 9th, while fires still smouldered in the ruins. A partial streetcar line was back in service, and the crews who ran the system in those weeks included teenagers, because the streetcar company had been operating a wartime training school for young workers, many of them girls of 13 to 15 years old, who had survived the morning of August 6th and reported back for duty. 2 of the streetcars that survived the blast were repaired, returned to service, and are still running scheduled routes in Hiroshima today, lovingly maintained, carrying commuters past the places they once carried the wounded. The banks reopened within days, honoring survivors' deposits even when the passbooks had burned along with the houses. Within weeks, a makeshift market was trading in the ruins near the station. None of this was ordered by any government. It was simply thousands of individual people deciding, without any coordination, that the city was not finished. But spontaneous survival is not the same as a future, and by 1948, Hiroshima's recovery had stalled. The city was bankrupt. Japan was bankrupt. The national government, rebuilding dozens of bombed cities at once, could offer Hiroshima nothing special. And this is where Hiroshima made the decision that separates it from every other destroyed city in history, and gives this film its title. The city's leaders, led by Mayor Shinzo Hamai, a survivor himself who had spent the days after the bomb organizing food distribution in the ruins, took an extraordinary argument to Tokyo. Hiroshima, they said, should not be rebuilt as an ordinary city. It had been destroyed by the first atomic bomb in history, and therefore its reconstruction should carry a meaning for all humanity. They drafted a special law, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial City Construction Law, declaring that Hiroshima would be rebuilt as a symbol of the human ideal of lasting peace. The law unlocked national funding and national land for the project, and under Japan's new post-war constitution, a law applying to a single city required something no Japanese law had ever needed before: a local referendum. So in July of 1949, the surviving people of Hiroshima went to the polls and voted on what their city should mean. The law passed with overwhelming support, and it remains, to this day, a unique legal document. Other cities rebuilt to forget. Hiroshima passed a law to remember. The military city that had lived by war since 1894 legally redefined itself as a city that would live by peace forever. In a story full of dark symmetry, this is the counter-symmetry, and it was chosen, deliberately, by referendum, by the people who had more right than anyone on earth to choose hatred instead. The law needed a physical form, and the man who gave it one was a young architect named Kenzo Tange. In 1949, the city held a design competition for a memorial park at the heart of the destroyed area, and Tange's winning design became one of the most influential works of 20th century architecture. Its genius is a single straight line. The park's central axis runs from the museum, through the arched cenotaph holding the register of the names of the dead, across the river, directly to the ruined dome. Stand at the cenotaph today, and the dome is framed exactly in the arch, so that memory is built into the geometry of the city itself. Tange, who had spent part of his youth in Hiroshima, and whose own family was touched by the bomb, went on to become Japan's most celebrated architect. His career, like the city's new identity, rose directly out of the delta's ashes. Around the park, an ordinary living city grew back at extraordinary speed, and two stories from those years tell you exactly what its spirit was. In the closing weeks of 1949, Hiroshima founded a professional baseball club, and it began play in Japan's newly reorganized league in 1950. The club was named the Hiroshima Carp, for Terumoto's Carp Castle, the detail we asked you to hold on to in Chapter 1. 4 centuries and 1 apocalypse ago, the team was poor, unsponsored by any major corporation, and within its first years it nearly folded. It was saved by its own fans, who collected donations to keep the club alive, including the famous barrel campaigns in which citizens who had almost nothing dropped coins into casks outside the stadium. The Carp became, and remain, the most community-rooted club in Japanese baseball, and when they finally won their first league championship in 1975, 30 years after the bomb, the celebration in Hiroshima was about something far larger than sport. The carp, in Japanese tradition, is the fish that swims up waterfalls. The second story is a company we met converting to war production in Chapter 5, Toyokoyo, its headquarters on the eastern edge of the city, survived the blast, and in the weeks after, its buildings served as an emergency hospital and temporary offices for the prefectural government. Within 4 months of the bombing, the company restarted production of its small 3-wheeled trucks, and those cheap, rugged vehicles became the workhorses of the reconstruction, hauling lumber and rubble through the ruins. The company grew as the city grew, and the world came to know it by the name on its cars. Mazda. It remains Hiroshima's industrial anchor today, a global car maker headquartered in a city the world once wrote off as poisoned ground, and its museum still displays the 3-wheeled truck that helped rebuild the Delta. But no story from these years carries the city's meaning further than the story of one girl, and we will tell it carefully and accurately from the record preserved by the Peace Memorial Museum. Her name was Sadako Sasaki. She was 2 years old on the day of the bomb, at home about a mile from the hypocenter, and she survived apparently unharmed. She grew into an athletic child, known as the fastest runner in her class, a member of her school's relay team. Then, in late 1954, 9 years after the bomb, she fell ill, and in February 1955 she was diagnosed with leukemia, one of the blood cancers that, as the Radiation Effects Research Foundation's long-term studies would confirm, rose measurably among survivors in the years after the war, especially among those exposed as young children. In the hospital, Sadako began folding paper cranes, inspired by the Japanese tradition that folding 1,000 cranes grants a wish. The museum's records indicate she folded more than 1,000, continuing even when paper ran short and she turned to medicine wrappers and scraps, folding some cranes so small she needed a pin to shape them. She died in October 1955. She was 12 years old. Her classmates refused to let her story end there. They campaigned for a monument, and the campaign spread to schools across Japan. In 1958, the Children's Peace Monument was unveiled in the Peace Memorial Park, a bronze statue of a girl holding a folded crane above her head, standing on a pedestal inscribed with a vow written by children. This is our cry. This is our prayer. Building peace in the world. Today, children around the world fold paper cranes and send them to Hiroshima by the millions every year. And they hang in glass cases around the monument in unbroken chains of colour. The bomb had made Hiroshima a name that adults argue about. Sadako made it a story that children understand. By the early 1960s, a visitor who had known the ruins would not have believed the city in front of them. The population had passed its pre-war level. The delta was covered in new streets, new bridges, new schools, a new baseball stadium, a short walk from the hypocenter, and at the center of it all, preserved in ruin while everything around it rose, stood the dome. Hiroshima had refused to disappear. Now it faced a harder task. It had to decide what to say. Chapter 11. The Voice of the Hibakusha. On the 1st of March, 1954, the United States tested a hydrogen bomb at Bikini Atoll in the Pacific, a weapon hundreds of times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. The test, code-named Castle Bravo, was a miscalculation. The explosion was far larger than its designers predicted, and its radioactive fallout drifted over a wide area of ocean, including a Japanese tuna fishing boat named the Daigo Fukuryu Maru, the Lucky Dragon No. 5, operating outside the announced danger zone. The crew of 23 sailed home to Japan sick with radiation exposure, and one of them, the radio operator, Aikichi Kuboyama, died months later. Japan erupted, 9 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Radiation had reached out and struck Japanese civilians a third time, in peacetime, while they fished. A petition against hydrogen bomb testing, begun by housewives in a Tokyo suburb, gathered tens of millions of signatures within a year, one of the largest citizen petitions in the country's history. Out of that movement came annual world conferences against atomic and hydrogen bombs, held in Hiroshima, and the city found itself transformed from a place that had suffered history into a place that convened it. And inside that movement, something more important was happening. The Hibakusha were beginning to speak. Remember where Chapter 9 left them, silenced first by censors, then by discrimination, hiding their scars and their city, through the late 1950s, that began to reverse. In 1956, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki founded a national organization, Nihon Hidankyo, the Japan Confederation of Atomic and Hydrogen Bomb Sufferers Organizations, with a mission stated in 2 demands: compensation and support for survivors, and the abolition of nuclear weapons, so that, in the phrase that became the survivors' vow, no one else would ever suffer as they had. Notice what is missing from those demands. Revenge is not among them. Hatred of America is not among them, from its founding documents forward. The survivors' movement aimed its testimony not against a nation, but against a weapon. And that distinction is the moral core of everything Hiroshima has said to the world since. The testimony itself became a form of work. Hard, costly work. Survivors stood in front of classrooms and cameras and described the morning of August 6th, again and again, for decades, reliving the worst day of their lives on schedule, because they had concluded that reliving it was the only way to prevent it. One of the best-known voices belongs to Setsuko Thurlow, who was a 13-year-old schoolgirl in Hiroshima, mobilized for war work about a mile from the hypocenter, and who was pulled from a collapsed building in which most of the girls around her died. She emigrated to Canada, and she has spent more than half a century telling that story to audiences around the world, insisting, as she has put it in her public addresses, that humanity and nuclear weapons cannot coexist. Another was Sunao Tsuboi, a 20-year-old student caught in the open about a mile from the blast, burned over much of his body, who lay unconscious for over a month and was 3 times told he would not survive. He became a school teacher, and then, for decades, one of the movement's most tireless leaders, co-chair of Nihon Hidankyo. Famous for the personal motto he repeated to interviewers until his death in 2021 at the age of 96. Never give up. Here is the question this chapter needs to ask directly, because every thoughtful viewer is already asking it. Why testimony? Against the largest weapons ever built. What is a schoolteacher's memory supposed to accomplish? The survivor's answer, proven over 70 years, is that testimony changes the category of the conversation. Governments discuss nuclear weapons as strategy, as deterrence, as numbers on a balance sheet. A survivor standing in the room turns the numbers back into a Tuesday morning, a streetcar, a classroom of 13-year-olds clearing fire breaks under a clear sky. The weapon becomes, for as long as the survivor speaks, what it actually is. That is why Hibakusha testimony has been sought at the United Nations, in treaty negotiations, in classrooms on every continent. It is the one argument in the nuclear debate that no counter-argument has ever managed to answer. Not every part of this era is simple, and honesty requires the complications. The Japanese anti-nuclear movement itself split in the 1960s along Cold War political lines, with rival organizations divided over whether to condemn Soviet tests as firmly as American ones. A schism that persists in weakened form to this day. And Hiroshima's own message has faced a harder question from elsewhere in Asia. Japan, critics point out, was not only a victim in that war, it was an empire whose armies devastated China, Korea, and Southeast Asia, and Hiroshima itself. As this film has spent 4 chapters showing, was that empire's Western military gateway. The city's answer to this criticism has evolved over the decades. The Peace Memorial Museum, which once presented mainly the city's suffering, has revised its exhibits more than once, and its permanent exhibition today includes Hiroshima's own history as a military city and the wartime context of the bombing. The city's official position, repeated in its annual peace declarations, is that remembering the bomb and reckoning with Japan's own war are not competing duties. A memory that only accuses others is propaganda. Hiroshima has worked, imperfectly and visibly, to be something better than that. Through all of this, the dome stood at the center of the argument, and by the 1960s the argument reached the dome itself. The ruin was decaying, and the city was divided about what to do with it. Some survivors wanted it demolished. It was painful to see. A wound kept permanently open in the middle of a living city. A building some people could not walk past without reliving the morning it burned. Others insisted that without it, forgetting would win. The decision arrived. According to the record preserved by the city, partly through the diary of a girl named Hiroko Kajiyama, who had been exposed to the bomb as a baby and died of leukemia at 16. She had written that only that ruined dome, as she called it, the sad-looking industrial exhibition hall, would go on telling future generations how dreadful the atomic bomb was. Her words were taken up by a preservation campaign. Donations came in from across Japan, and in 1966 the city council voted to preserve the dome permanently, funding its careful reinforcement so that the ruin would neither collapse nor ever be restored. 30 years later, in 1996, the United Nations cultural organization UNESCO inscribed the atomic bomb dome on the World Heritage List, placing Jan Letzel's gutted exhibition hall alongside the pyramids and the cathedrals as part of the permanent inheritance of humanity. Even that moment carried the weight of unfinished argument. The United States formally dissociated itself from the decision, noting its concern that the inscription lacked historical context about the war, and China recorded its own reservations, citing the suffering inflicted by Japan's wartime aggression. The dome entered the world's memory with the world's disagreements attached, which is, if you think about it, exactly the honest way for it to stand. By the end of the century, the survivors had turned a silent city into one of the most listened to places on Earth. But the Hibakusha were aging, and a question was beginning to press on Hiroshima that would define its next decades. What happens to testimony when the witnesses are gone? And one visit, long imagined and long considered politically impossible, had still never happened. No sitting president of the United States had ever come to Hiroshima. That visit, when it finally came, is where we go next. Chapter 12. Obama, the G7, and the unfinished argument. For 71 years, one visit did not happen. American presidents came to Japan many times. They visited Tokyo. They addressed parliaments. They dined with emperors. But no sitting president of the United States ever stood in Hiroshima, and everyone on both sides of the Pacific understood why. In America, any president who went risked being accused of apologizing for a decision most Americans had been taught was necessary and just. In Japan, any visit that did not include an apology risked reopening the wound instead of honoring it. The two countries had built one of the closest alliances in the world, and at the center of it they had left a room that neither side would enter. Then, on May 27th, 2016, a presidential motorcade drove into the Peace Memorial Park, and Barack Obama walked the axis of Kenzo Tange's design, past the museum, to the cenotaph that holds the register of the dead. Watch the diplomacy of that day closely, because it is a masterclass in how two nations handle an unhealed history. Obama did not apologize, and the White House had said plainly beforehand that he would not. The Japanese government, for its part, did not ask him to. Instead, the president laid a wreath and spoke of the morning when death fell from the sky and the world was changed. And he called for the moral awakening that the nuclear age still awaits. He spoke of the dead not as Japanese casualties, but as human beings, including, and he named this specifically, the thousands of Koreans who died in Hiroshima that morning, many of them laborers brought to Japan under colonial rule, and the small number of American prisoners of war who were held in the city. That American detail existed in the record largely because of one man, a Hiroshima survivor named Shigeaki Mori, a historian who had spent decades of his own life and money documenting the 12 American prisoners who died in the bombing, tracking down their families in the United States so that their names would be recorded and their relatives would know. And then came the image that traveled around the world. Obama embraced that same man, Shigeaki Mori, in front of the cameras, a survivor of the bomb who had devoted his life to honoring American victims, held by the president of the country that dropped it. No apology was given, and no apology was demanded, and somehow the moment landed in both countries as something better than either. Polling by the Japanese news agency Kyodo News after the visit found approval among the Japanese public at overwhelming levels, well above 90%. And in Hiroshima, the response voiced by survivors interviewed at the time was not triumph, but a kind of quiet completion. He came. He listened. That was what they had asked. There is a reasonable criticism of that day, and it deserves saying out loud. Words are not policy. The same administration that spoke in Hiroshima of a world without nuclear weapons was also funding a long-term modernization of the American arsenal. And every nuclear power on Earth has done the same in the years since. Hiroshima has heard beautiful speeches for 80 years, and the weapons remain. The visit changed the emotional history of the alliance. It did not change a single warhead. Both of those facts are true, and the people of Hiroshima, who are not naive, hold both of them at once. The years that followed brought the argument to Hiroshima's doorstep again and again. In 2017, the United Nations adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, driven by a campaign in which Hibakusha testimony played a central role. And when the campaign coalition ICAN received that year's Nobel Peace Prize, it was Setsuko Thurlow, the schoolgirl from Chapter 11, now in her 80s, who stood in Oslo to help accept it and to deliver the lecture. The treaty entered into force in 2021. Not one nuclear-armed state has joined it, and neither has Japan, which shelters under the American nuclear umbrella. The gap between what Hiroshima asks and what governments do has never been measured more precisely than by that treaty's signature page. In May of 2023, the argument arrived in its most spectacular form yet. The G7 summit, the gathering of the leaders of the world's major democracies, was held in Hiroshima itself, hosted by Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, whose family roots and political constituency are in the city. The leaders of the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, and Japan walked together through the Peace Memorial Museum, past the stopped watches and the children's burned uniforms, and laid wreaths at the cenotaph. 3 of those leaders commanded nuclear arsenals, and in the middle of the summit, in a moment no scriptwriter would have dared invent, President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine flew in from a war in which Russian nuclear threats were live and explicit, and stood in the city where the nuclear age began. The summit's declaration spoke of a world without nuclear weapons as an ultimate goal while defending nuclear deterrence in the present. Hiroshima's mayor and the survivor organizations welcomed the visit and criticized the declaration in the same breath. The city has learned to do both. Then, in October 2024, came the recognition the survivors had never sought and absolutely earned. The Norwegian Nobel Committee awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to Nihon Hidankyo, the Confederation of Atomic Bomb Survivors, founded in 1956, citing its decades of witness testimony that helped establish what the committee called the nuclear taboo, the powerful international norm against the use of these weapons. In its announcement, the committee warned that this taboo is now under pressure in a way it has not been for generations. The prize went to an organization whose members are in their late 80s and 90s, and every observer understood the timing. The world was thanking the witnesses while there was still time to thank them, and admitting, in the same gesture, that it fears what happens when they are gone. That fear is the quiet crisis of Hiroshima today. In 2026, the average age of the Hibakusha now exceeds 85, according to the annual figures published by Japan's health ministry, and their numbers fall every year. The city has answered with a program as remarkable as anything in this story. Trained successors, called memory keepers, spend years learning a single survivor's testimony, checking every detail with the survivor themselves, and then telling that story in schools and at the museum after the survivor no longer can. It is memory, passed hand to hand like the buckets of water in the ruins of 1945. In August of 2025, the city marked the 80th anniversary of the bombing, with the largest commemoration in its history. And the question hanging over the ceremony was the same question hanging over this chapter: whether the world will still listen when the last voice that was there falls silent. And around all of this, mostly unnoticed by the pilgrims and the presidents, stands the fact that may be the most eloquent answer of all. Hiroshima is simply a city. 1.2 million people in the metropolitan region, office towers and oyster boats, the carp playing to sold-out crowds a short walk from the dome, streetcars, including the survivor cars of 1945, still running the Delta routes, children crossing the Aoi Bridge on their way to school, over the T-shape that was once an aiming point. The planners of 1945 chose Hiroshima to demonstrate what their weapon could do to a city. 81 years later, the city itself is the demonstration of what the weapon could not do. Chapter 13. What Hiroshima asks of us. Go back, one last time, to the bridge where we started. Stand on the Motoyasu River in the early morning, when the water is still and the dome's reflection lies unbroken on the surface. The river arriving under your feet has come down through Mori Teramoto's delta for as long as there has been a delta. It flowed past the castle builders of 1589, past the rice dealer opening his shutters in the 1750s, past the emperor's headquarters in 1894, past the pleasure boats in front of Jan Letzel's new dome in 1915, past the students walking to the demolition sites in the summer of 1945. On the morning of August 6th, it received the wounded and the dead. 3 days later, it reflected a running streetcar. It has reflected the rebuilding every morning since. The river keeps no memory. That work belongs entirely to the city built beside it, and no city on earth has taken the work more seriously. This story has shown you a terrible symmetry. The same geography that founded the city marked it for selection. The same militarism that made Hiroshima proud and prosperous placed it at the top of a target list. The same country that dropped the bomb produced the reporter who told the world, and the president who finally came to the cenotaph. History in Hiroshima does not divide neatly into guilt and innocence, and the city itself, in its museum and its declarations, has stopped pretending that it does. Hiroshima was an imperial military city, and Hiroshima was tens of thousands of children on an ordinary Monday morning. Both are true. The bomb did not distinguish between them. That is the point about the bomb. And this story has shown you a counter-symmetry, chosen where the first was inflicted. A city that lived by war for 50 years voted, as one of its first free acts after the catastrophe, to define itself by peace forever. Survivors who had every right to hatred built a movement with no hatred in it, aimed at a weapon rather than a nation. A people who were silenced for years have spent every year since making sure the silence never returns, training the next generation to carry testimony the way other cities carry founding legends. We told you at the beginning that most cities hide their worst day, and Hiroshima built itself around it. Now you know that this was never a metaphor. It is a law, passed by referendum. It is an axis, drawn by an architect. It is a ruin, preserved by a city council vote, won in part by a dead girl's diary. It is a baseball team named for a castle, kept alive by coins from the pockets of survivors. It is a German cake, still sold in every department store in Japan. First baked inside the building, the world now keeps in ruins. Remembering, in Hiroshima, is not a mood, it is infrastructure. So what does this city ask of us? The people watching from the country that built the bomb, and from the continent whose wars incubated it. Not guilt, The survivors have said so, consistently, for 70 years. Guilt looks backward, and their entire project looks forward. What Hiroshima asks is simpler and much harder. It asks us to know what happened, specifically, humanly, at 8:15 on an ordinary morning, and to carry that knowledge into a world that still holds roughly 12,000 nuclear warheads. By the current estimates of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute and the Federation of American Scientists, most of them far more powerful than Little Boy, the witnesses are nearly gone. The weapons are not. Between those two facts stands nothing but memory. And memory, as this city has proven, is a thing that people either build or lose. The planners chose Hiroshima as a target to end a war. The city, in answer, chose itself for something larger, to stand at the center of the question that will follow humanity for as long as the weapons exist. It has kept that post for 80 years, through silence and censorship, through prizes and summits, through the slow loss of everyone who was there. Tomorrow morning, at 8:15, the peace bell will sound across the water, the way it does every year on the 6th of August, and a city of more than 1 million people will pause, one breath long, and then go on living. The streetcars will run, the oyster boats will go out, the children will cross the bridge above the old aiming point, carrying school bags, not knowing yet that they are also carrying the answer. Hiroshima was chosen as a target. It refused to disappear. It is still refusing, every single morning, and now the refusing and the remembering belong to all of us.